Good morning. I have never met a business partner who doesn't expect their pizza in 30 minutes or less. And by pizza, I mean their analytics dashboard. You can't blame them. They're hungry for data. But I also haven't met a business partner that understands the details of the analytics workflow. They all have a high level understanding, just not the details. Every process has its workflow, and understanding its details will help manage everyone's expectations. It'll also allow both sides, tech and the business, to ask the right questions at every step. So, what's this high-level flow that everyone understands? We all have different names for each of the 5 steps, but they're essentially define the problem, collect and prepare the data, analyze the data, visualize and communicate the results, and if the solution sticks, implement and monitor the solution. Good production support. I know that list is a little obvious, but before I get into the less obvious details, let's walk through what each of those 5 steps really means. Defining the problem is the first step in any analytics workflow. You need to understand what questions you're trying to answer or what problems you're trying to solve, and hopefully you're doing it with commercial intent, with a commercial imagination. The point of this step, like any SDLC, software development lifecycle, SDLC step, is to create a shared understanding of where you are and where you need to be before you move on to collecting and preparing the data. Step 1 is never that simple, and it is different than more build an app deliverables, but I'll get into why after we walk through all 5 steps. The second step was to collect and prepare data. This is when you need to identify relevant sources and extract the necessary data from those sources, what some call data wrangling. It will inevitably involve cleaning and transforming the data to ensure that it's accurate and consistent, and that data from different sources are connected through some kind of common set of keys. Why is step 2 so hard? Because most systems weren't designed to solve for future data needs. Once you have the data ready, you can move on to analyzing it, which was the third high-level step. Data analysis involves using basic arithmetic and calling it statistics to be fancy, or if you want to be really fancy, calling it machine learning. Total scam. To basically uncover patterns and relationships in the data. Once you have analyzed the data, you'd enter step 4, where you communicate your findings to your stakeholders. This is where data visualization comes in, because it's an accessible, that's the key word, accessible way to present your results in a clear and concise manner. And just like how the iPhone, the whole iPhone experience really raised our expectations in non-iPhone digital experiences, everyone in the business world now has high expectations for analytics output. There's no stakeholder wants an Excel spreadsheet anymore. They now expect, and with good reason, data visualization, even when there's nothing to show. So, you plot charts, graphs, bubbles in the usual tools, Tableau, Power BI, Click, ThoughtSpot, whatever. And the final step, step 5, you make sure that the new product, that dashboard, lives comfortably past its hopefully long, useful life. You do that with monitoring and other production support practices. Everyone understands those 5 steps in that order. No one's trained on it that I'm aware of. It's so common in business that it's become business intuition. so common, and this is the problem, that it keeps the conversation between tech and the business at a useless high level. What can we do about it? Well, we can get both sides to understand the workflow so well that they can ask the right questions on one side and answer them in plain English on the other. Transparency. It demands depth on both sides of this partnership. So let's get into it. Although I have a giant tree that fell over that I need to somehow get past. Okay, so you're at step one. I'll try to do this while climbing over this fallen tree. Step one was defining the problem. What are the questions that are not typically asked that should be? There we go. Defining the analytics problem is all about how you recast the problem definition stage so as to get real stakeholder insights. For me, it's all about business process. In addition to asking about the core question that needs an answer, the data that's missing, both sides need to frame the ask in terms of business process. The one that's currently lacking, together, you and your partner need to map out the process that now exists. Or if one doesn't exist, and it usually doesn't, explore which adjacent processes do exist that are flexible enough that could be extended to also include the new data, the new flow. If you're on the tech side, don't offer a report or a dashboard, propose a workflow. From a tech perspective, that's a small amount of additional work, but totally worth it, because tech has developed billions of bespoke reports that, if they're lucky, are used once or twice total. That's a lot of throwaway effort, a lot of throwaway tech work. Why? Because those reports, their use, live outside the common daily practices, processes of the business. They answer important questions. No one is second guessing that. They are important questions, but they live outside the boundaries, the habits of the teams that would most benefit from those answers. So, don't build a report, don't build a dashboard, build a workflow for all the steps from here's your report to that data changed business practice and business outcomes. Let's be honest, if you're in tech, when your business stakeholders say, I just, need the report, no need for a workflow, what they're not saying is, I'd be surprised if you even developed the report before I retired. So why would I ask for more work from you when my pleas for, less work have failed to produce in the past? That's completely fair. What business stakeholders don't see, and this is aimed at you, business stakeholders, lots of spider webs, is that no one in tech wants to build something that's used just once or twice. Developers like you, their business counterparts, want to have real impact. So building impact into your ask, even when it looks like more work, actually gets the delivery done faster. It's motivation 101. And before we jump off this, never confuse a dashboard with a workflow. One is a web page with lots of interesting data. The other is a client activity-driven, event-driven compulsion to visit every aspect of that page every day, multiple times a day, to solve a real business problem. Because that's your job. People don't engage workflows that aren't central to doing their job. Think daily use of data insights to solve real business problems that demonstrably drive business value. That's a workflow, not a dashboard. So that's the first missing question. What else is missing from step one in terms of conversations between tech and the business? Transparency around prioritization. We are fundamentally hardwired as humans to be single-threaded. And anyone in tech who has the skills to produce data dashboards and process workflows will never come to the table with nothing on their delivery plate. And it's worse than that, actually, because the 10 things on their plate before you, as the business stakeholder, came along were each the highest priority of the day. When everything is priority one, nothing is priority one. So if you're on the business side and the person in tech you're working with and their boss and their boss's boss have all sworn that your need is priority number one, what they fail to mention is the last 10 times that they said the same thing to one of your peers, or God forbid for you, someone more senior and powerful in the management hierarchy than you. If you're in tech, it is never about budget, whether you have it or not. It is always about how to manage with a spine or through effective partnership, being single-threaded when your stakeholders demand multi-threaded results. How you manage that potential spinelessness or weak partnership will determine your collective frustration level, biz and tech. Because that transparency, that collaboration determines how long it'll take before both sides get what they need and whether that delivery will ultimately be successful. Whoa! This is actually a moment when you, as a business stakeholder, can help your own cause. Instead of living the fantasy that your poor tech partner is going to effectively manage the 10 other business stakeholders that were fed the same garbage as you, that their deliverable is priority number one. You have the skill that most nerds don't. You can clear the priority path, not by asking your tech partner if they need help with that, because they'll always say they don't. Misplaced confidence. You shouldn't ask if you can help. You should just help. As long as your tech partner is smart enough to share their actual list of priorities, their actual list of business people in waiting, you can have the conversation that poor single-threaded tech partner doesn't have the skill to. And it's not just about skill. Like, honestly, it's about power and influence, two things that tech folks struggle with. It's not how our brains work. We're math nerds, we're logic nerds. We spit when we talk, metaphorically. How do you, as a business stakeholder, help? Before I answer that question, check out this other fallen tree. I get to walk underneath it. That is so cool. Okay, how do you help? If your tech partner has 10 deliverables on their plate and you're the new number one, I guarantee you that the other 9 stakeholders have no idea that you're the new number one. Or let's be more accurate. You might be the new number one, but they still think they're getting their number 4 priority on Friday because it was promised to them months ago. And things were prioritized and reprioritized, and that's the way, a fluid, dynamic business works. So unless you have an extraordinary tech partner, you're, in the case of 10 priorities, you're 9 conversations away from paving the path for speedy delivery of your agenda. I know. Managing those priorities is part of tech's job. I wholeheartedly agree. And they do it poorly. If you want to be a partner and not just a stakeholder, help them. You're actually a team. Help them manage their other stakeholders. Don't just let them, use your name. You're not as special as you think you are. Pick up the phone and call your internal competition. Think of it as helping yourself. We're going to come back to this theme, by the way, when we're talking about the next step, collecting data. Actually, you know what? Let's just jump there. Step 2, collecting and preparing data. There's a 100% chance that your analytics partners do not own the core systems where the data you need lives. They have to go and negotiate your agenda with, systems owners who have their own business partners driving their priorities. Your analytics partners will do their best to push your priorities with the owners of the systems. Do you know what they won't do? Maybe even can't do? Push your priorities with the business users that the owners of the systems think are their bosses. So while you have the phone in your hand, calling the business owners of priorities 2 through 10, you should also call the business owners of the systems where your data lives. For all the same reasons we talked about in step 1. Nice little creek. What other questions need to be asked at this step? There will always be data that lives outside your reach. 2 good examples. Data that lives at another company, with or without an API, and tribal data that lives inside your users' heads, usually typed in manually. This is where we bring back our conversation of workflow. So important. Not dashboards, workflow. If you map out the end-to-end data supply chain for the analytics you need, there will be holes that can only be filled by people. People who, using the 2 examples of data that that are out of your reach, people who, 1, know where to browse to copy and paste it into their Excel, and 2, people who know the missing element because it lives in their head or the head of some SME they know, subject matter expert, SME or SME. If your solution is a workflow, you can automate the collection of out-of-reach data with RPA, robotic process automation. And or you can memorialize tribal data, storing it in a database, a golden source repository, instead of someone's brain, reducing the risk of losing that talent. Framing analytics asks as workflow has so many virtuous adjacencies that I'm always surprised when it's challenged as an approach. Quick real-world example. At my last shop, the C-levels were always interested in return to office metrics. They asked for the usual set of Tableau dashboards, card swipe data, who's in, who isn't. But the C-levels failed to understand that dashboards are optional at best. in the lives of the managers who are expected to use them. Every functional manager has their daily workflows, and no one's includes a visit to the return to office dashboard. If the workflow doesn't exist, the only way to generate usage is through top of house mandates. And mandates are the least effective path to cultural transformation. If anything, hearts and minds are lost through mandates. What should they have done? Identified an existing weekly habit, a mandatory weekly practice, an existing business workflow that was adjacent to the management of remote work. For instance, if you ask your workforce to fill in weekly timesheets, that workflow, when you as a manager are entering your hours, that workflow can include not just the hours that your team booked, but their return to office metrics. It's a terrible example because if you work in the kind of place that forces the horror of timesheets on you, you should change your org or change your org. But you get the point. Next step, step 3, analyzing the data. What are the questions to ask? What's usually lost in this step is what I call the infinite loop. When you think of steps 1 through 5, you probably visualize a line, a straight line. Step 1 leads to step 2, which leads to step 3, etc., etc. The problem is that there's this loop between steps 2 and 3 because data analysis leads to undiscovered requirements. Data that you didn't think you'd need, systems that you didn't coordinate with, questions that upon initial analysis led to more questions and more complex questions. And that loop can be the equivalent of a tire spinning in the mud. The conversation is usually misframed by tech as being scope creep. It's not. It's the nature of complexity. It's hard to box. It's unruly. So the questions that should be asked at this step are about the trade-offs both sides can make. The trade-offs with the biz are about the concision they'll need in iteration 1 of the deliverables. And the trade-offs with tech are about the impact of each iteration, each loop on priorities 2 through 10, the stuff waiting in the queue. If you're the kind of business partner who, in the earlier steps, picked up the phone to clear the path, each loop will reduce your credibility with your fellow stakeholders in waiting. This is why it's so important that everyone embraces the idea of a minimum viable product. Not in the agile sense. There is no such thing as once and done with analytics or workflows. Getting to value is a process, and it's never linear. So a commitment to being priority number 1 needs to be balanced with giving tech breathing room between steps 3 and 4 so they can advance other stakeholders' priorities. And it's the right time for breathing room because step 4, visualizing and communicating results, is necessarily an iterative exercise. What do I mean? I have never come across an analytics visualization that wasn't socialized broadly by the person who requested it. And I don't know of anyone who is on the receiving end of those demos that will sit there and say, yeah, this is perfect. This is all we need. Everyone who gets a taste is a chef. And depending on their political weight, their input on the demo might radically change the next iteration, adding a loop or two. And there will be a next iteration. So step 4 is another loop. Back to step 2 and 3. Sometimes the feedback is so fundamental that the provider of the feedback, if they're influential enough, will demand that you go back to step 1. They won't use the language of step 1, problem definition, but they will tear it apart. The point here is that we generally don't acknowledge the iterative nature of analytics deliveries. So the question to ask at step 4, the phone calls to make, are very similar to what happened at step 3. If you're a senior business person waiting for this delivery, or a senior tech person who is waiting to check the done box, you'll definitely get an update from the more junior person on your team about the iterations, but they'll be downplayed. I get why, because the people in the weeds sweat the details, and they've lived the iterative nature of those deliverables over and over again, iteratively, recursively, I should say. But as a senior, unless you question, unless you challenge each iteration, you risk that stuck in the mud feeling, what one of my smarter friends calls the asymptotic delivery curve. That's a fancy way of saying that the closer you get to done, the longer it takes, with a very good chance that you never get to done. Step 5 is actually the easiest step, because to get to monitoring in place, to get world-class production support in place, there's little chance of potentially infinite loops. So, what does all this have to do with pizza, which is, I think, where I started the walk? Even before Domino's perfected the pizza making workflow, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, Google it. Even before they actually delivered on world-class digital automation, Domino's, people use the analogy of pizza making to illustrate the value of workflows and workflow automation. Why? Because everyone knows on some level how a pizza is made. Dough is rolled, cheese is sprinkled, toppings are added, bake, eat. So it shouldn't surprise you to hear that delivering analytics is like making a pizza. Not eating a pizza, because eating pizza is fun, but making it. I could go a lot of different ways with this. Like, the dough is the business problem, the sauce is your core data, the cheese is the reference data that holds it all together, that binding agent. The pizza oven is your analytics platform, etc., etc., etc. Or I could mean that analytics is like pizza making because you need to have all the ingredients ready to make sure that they're the highest quality ingredients and in the right quantities. You need a real pizza oven, like Tableau or Power BI or Click or whatever. And cooking time may vary depending on the complexity of the recipe. Look, lots of different ways to skin this pizza. But what I really mean is that analytics is like making a pizza, because if your customers demand one in 30 minutes or less, you're gonna need to immerse yourself in the value of workflow and automate the hell out of your business processes. It's all about the workflow. That's it. Hope you got something out of this.